Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bruce Monadar. I'll be officially opening this in a second. We're just making sure that we have the panelists all connected by sound.
Is it on now?
Professor Siddiqui?
Yes, please. I'm around now.
Okay, that's good. And
I'm very sorry for you guys.
No, but that sounds you're coming through okay now. So we'll launch the webinar.
That's very good. Yeah.
Okay, you can put yourself on mute for the short run. Okay. Good day, everybody. I guess I can't say good morning. It's morning in Ottawa, but not where most of the panelists are. My name is Bruce Monador, and I'm the chair of the Africa Study Group. We are happy to co-sponsor this event with the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. I will just say a couple of words and then turn it over to Teddy Sami of the Norman Paterson School to say a couple of words himself, and he'll turn over to Deki Kabongi, who will introduce the panelists and moderate the event. So the issue for the Africa Study Group is the question of governance and development in Africa, and we have had a series of webinars on the subject, including governance and political processes, issues of governance and security, and governance and electoral processes. And we hope to have a session on governance and electricity fairly soon. We consider good governance is essential to Africa, and defined narrowly, it includes transparency, respect for the rule of law, the fight against corruption, and the holding of democratic elections by universal suffrage. Despite the progress made in Africa over the last 20 years, there is still a lot of sustainability and consolidation process for governance to continue to see further improvement. And we view the discussion today as something that's very much in line with that. So we've been very happy to co-sponsor this with NIPSIA. So with that, I'm going to take my picture off and turn it over to Teddy Sami to do an introduction on the behalf of NIPSIA and then pass it to Deki.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. As Bruce mentioned, I'm a professor and the director at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, located at Carleton University in Ottawa. We're delighted, obviously, to collaborate with the Africa Study Group for today's speaking event on corruption and anti-corruption in Sub-Saharan Africa. As the announcement for today's event indicates, corruption is a serious governance challenge for many African countries. Corruption, according to Transparency International, is defined as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. This definition includes corruption practices in both the public and private sectors. However, when we look at the latest ranking of perceptions of corruption in 2020, for about 180 countries, according to Transparency International, I have to point out that their definition actually considers the perception of corruption, in the public sector. And according to that ranking, we find many sub-Saharan African countries at the bottom of the list. Social scientists, policymakers have spent a lot of time in understanding this problem, in understanding its causes, its consequences, and how to address it. But beyond the theories, beyond the rankings that are published, beyond the numbers that we see, there's the issue of persistence of corruption over time and its pervasiveness that is often decried by a range of actors. We are often under the impression that the problem is getting worse, not better, and despite many attempts to address it. So let me thank, I guess in that sense, I mean, based on what I've just said, corruption would be defined, in my view, as a wicked problem, something that is extremely difficult to understand and to deal with in particular, right? So I'd like to thank our panelists for being with us today. They will be formally introduced by my colleague, Dr. Kabongi, in a few minutes. And today we will look at two contrasting cases of South Africa and Uganda. I call them contrasting because they are ranked quite differently according to what you can see on the map. Uganda was ranked 142 in 2020. South Africa was ranked, I believe, in 69th position. I would also like to thank Dr. Kabongi, who's going to moderate the discussion. Dr. Kabongi is a graduate of our school. He's a fellow and lecturer at the school as well. And so I want to thank him for moderating this webinar. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Deki, for the rest of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sami. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's my pleasure to be the moderator for this webinar. As you know, the topic is very interesting. Professor Sami just gave a short but accurate pictures from Transparency International and the state of corruption in the African continent. So it's our pleasure to have three interesting panelists. Professor Dorasami from Durban University of Technology in South Africa, Professor Makara from Makara University, and Mr. Mwenda, who is a scholar and independent journalist, businessman as well, based in Kampala. So you read the short biography of each of the panelists. These are very knowledgeable people who will talk to us regarding the two contrasting cases of corruption in Africa. One is South Africa, and that is going to be the focus of Professor Dorasami's presentation. And then we'll have Professor Makara and Andrew Mwenda talk about the case of corruption and anti-corruption institutions in Uganda, as well as I expect they will also elaborate on cases in the African Great Lakes region to reflect on their own experience. So in terms of the order of speaking, I will first turn to Professor Dorasami. Each of the panelists will have around 25 minutes to present, to make the presentation. And we will only have a questions and answer session after all the panelists have presented. So we will start with Professor Dorasami. After that is going to be the turn of Professor Sabiti, and we'll have Mr. Mwenda at the end. After that, we'll collect questions, and panelists will be able to respond to audience's questions. So, Professor Dorasami, I'm gonna turn the microphone to you. The floor is yours now. Please go ahead. And if you need any help me showing your slides, let me know.
You could hear it, Deki. Good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. A warm welcome. It's still warm here in South Africa to all of you. Thank you to the Carleton University and the unit that for co-hosting and inviting me to present on the various issues pertaining to corruption. If we can commence with the slides, Deki. Thank you. Would you be able to put up the slides, Deki?
Can you see my screen?
No, we can't see the slides.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
You hit the share screen button at the bottom that's below you. You should
Yes,
be able to see a share screen.
Share screen.
Yeah,
Great.
okay. No, it's coming now. That's fine.
Okay.
Are you okay now?
Yeah, that's fine. If we could go on to slide 2. Yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you. Basically, I think the two previous speakers have quite clearly alluded to the impact of corruption on various aspects of life. And it's quite clear that the effects are multiple, affecting society in terms of justice, equity, equality, human rights, trust, economic development. But more specifically, from the South African perspective, our National Development Plan, the African Union Agenda 63, and the SDGs, obviously, the achievement of those goals have been negatively impacted by the escalating levels of corruption across the African continent. But the question is enough being done to erode it? Or are the corrupt forces too powerful to be destroyed? Deki, if you could move on to slide 2.
This is your
Okay,
slide number two.
this is fine, thank you. Now, if one had to look at the CPI score and even look at the ranking scores, there is a gradual, if I may say, improvement. But the concern is, if one looks at the impact on the economy, on development, poverty, and other constructs, the significant destruction is still there. So long as there is that level of rating, despite the fact there is a gradual change, the consequences are still dire and it's still being felt in every aspect of society. If we could move on to the third slide. Thank you. The next question is, why is corruption not declining in African countries? I think the first important fact, which could be quite contentious, is the emergence of a new Black elite. Now, if one has to look at the perspective of the South African political environment, the primary process was to change the economy in a post-apartheid South Africa. And this, one of the consequences of this has been the drive to accelerate the emergence of a new Black elite. Despite institutional interventions like Black economic empowerment and affirmative action and the supporting legislation, we still find that there has been a continued existence of large corporations and white-owned businesses that have dominated the economy. Competition has remained very high, and the demand for public services and for goods has become very fierce. So it is in this context that an informal political economic system at the various spheres of government has started to emerge. The outcome is networks of state officials and ambitious entrepreneurs involved in procurement rigging. Now, while one may say that the escalation has really grown during the Zuma's presidency, I think a point to be argued is that this has started well before the Zuma presidency, more so even before the Zuma-Gupta network. And even if one has to look at or read the book on How to Steal a City by Crispian Over, it is abundantly clear that this system of the emergence of a particular group of politically and economically aligned individuals has existed for a long period of time. The second factor is accountability. Now, it is quite clear that poor accountability inhibits sustainability, long-term growth, human rights, and basically undermines human development. Respect for the law allows people to access better basic services. However, without accountability, detection is minimized, self-regulation is weakened, and trust is diminished. However, when there is limited information provision, such as financial and asset disclosure, poor oversight on accurate disclosure, and inactive public reporting mechanisms, then the drive towards accountability becomes weakened. Another related factor is that most accountability interventions are built on the principal-agent approach, where one would find that the principal, for example, the Ministry of Agriculture, will enact reform and relies on frontline agents, such as municipalities, to carry out tasks accordingly. But when the system is corrupt, or the agent is corrupt, or even the principal is corrupt, then there's very little hope of having these reforms optimally effected. For example, there were cases of the former chief operations officer of Paterson accused of having accepted bribes or cause bribes to have been paid to various government officials in order to secure contracts with the South African government. Relatedly, there's another case of a chief magistrate in Pretoria who was alleged to have received security-related improvements by Bosasa. Other cases of corruption where the principal agent approach has really failed includes our power utility Eskom and PRASA, which is the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa. Now, if you look at the diagram or the figure that I've got here in terms of corruption in municipalities. Now, in such cases, and with South Africa's political system, there is a high level of decentralization from national, provincial to municipal level. But you would find that from 2017 to 2018, especially in the metropolitan municipalities, while they may have much power in terms of greater access to resources, you would find that there is a gradual increase in corruption, especially in the two main municipalities in South Africa, which is Johannesburg and the eThekwini municipality, which is in Durban. So here again, you would notice the increase. While one may say accountability, there's greater control or expectation of accountability when there's decentralization. But here you would find that there's also, to the contrary, opportunity for corruption because of access to greater resources and decision-making powers in a decentralized situation. Becky, if we could move to the next slide. Another factor is transparency, well spoken about in terms of having an open agenda, in terms of sharing information. But I think an important aligned factor to this is our laws relating to the right to information. And here you find that one of the mitigating factors is that while we talk about transparency and aligned to accountability, do the laws allow to the access to information in terms of more open-ended laws? Several studies again have found that access to information is positively correlated to control of corruption. But the actual impact of this right to information laws seems to depend on the commitment of strong leadership and the political rulers at the point in time. Aligned to that as well, to what extent, when one speaks about freedom of press and association, is that really guaranteed? And also, is there effective monitoring and evaluation mechanisms that allows the identification and even dismissal of officials who are guilty of corruption? The 2019 and 2020 report, for example, by the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development stated that budget cuts have negatively impact on the sharing of information. And this has resulted in one particular institution, which is a national provincial authority, not being able to share as much information as expected because of budget cuts, which has impacted on public reporting. But if budget cuts are impacting on reporting, then obviously it's going to have a negative impact in terms of transparency and sharing of information on various public domains. Another factor is a lack of political will and judicial will. Anti-corruption practices and legislation will not work if there's no political will to stop corruption. As much as there is awareness and exposure of corruption, the power and the might of those in power can interfere to sweep corruption under the carpet. Here again, research has shown a strong correlation between corruption and the effectiveness of the judiciary. While there may be talk about improving training and appointment of judges and prosecutors, codes of conduct, such measures do not suffice. They are not enough to curb political interference and discourage huge bribes. Without leadership acting as a beacon of hope, corruption cannot stop, or rather will not stop. According to the Afrobarometer reporting for 2002 and 2015 as shown, sorry if you could, yes, you would see that the public perception is that there has been a growing disregard for the South African laws, parliament, and courts by the president ruling during that period of time, and that would be President Zuma. It is these perceptions that has intensified the already deep concerns about official corruption and the impunity that seems to pervade for officials who break the law. But also linked to this, that when such cases arise, as we have with the Zondo Commission at the moment, there is millions of taxpayers' money which have been spent in terms of managing or overseeing these commissions, calling in witnesses, in terms of trying to determine what would be the actual outcome of these commissions. If you could move to the next slide. Thank you. Now, when one speaks of state capture, that is the talk almost every day, especially with the goings on with the Zondo Commission. But the perception is, are leaders too powerful to be imprisoned? Are those companies which have been procuring with government, are they major assets which should not be tampered with, as it's going to impact on economic development in South Africa? Now, the cost of the state capture is estimated to be about 200 billion rands, about 17 billion US dollars. While it has been reported that during the period or term of the presidency, Zuma's presidency, the South African economy has lost almost 1 trillion rands, approximately 83 billion US dollars. Further, Corruption Watch reported that the scale of mining operations and the large sums of money involved in procuring resources within the South African environment, such as securing concessions, obtaining permits, customs clearance, is costing the South African economy almost 5 to 10% of its annual production. If this is growing, then there's also the concurrent or perilous feeling or perceptions that impunity for corruption amongst the grand corruptors is growing as well. This sense is reinforced by evidence of leaders still remaining in office, corrupt activities continuing, anti-corruption initiatives being repressed, and also the growth of criminal networks. And in several cases where witnesses, unfortunately, had lost their lives. So the question is, does the game of looting continue? The other factor to consider is the restrictions on anti-corruption activists. Restrictions on funding to support the activities of such organizations, limitations on their freedom of speech, limitations on association, is actually negatively impacting on people who want to speak out. For example, a few years ago, the editor of a newspaper, The Citizen, was dismissed after publishing an article on corruption involving a former finance minister and further criticizing the individual. So the question is, if freedom of expression is enshrined in the Constitution, why are such activities still continuing within our environment? Another factor to consider is awareness versus rejection. Many of us, the masses as well, are aware of what corruption is. We have different perceptions of what constitutes corruption, but are people willing to act against it? Are they willing to take action to fight against corruption? What is missing is the translation of awareness of corruption into an actual rejection of corruption. Refusing to be bribed, not voting for the corrupt, and refusing to turn a blind eye to corruption. This rejection is essential for sustained public pressure for change. People need to have a better understanding of what they can do about it. There needs to be a broadening of avenues for the masses to be able to move from awareness to action, constituting actual rejection. Another factor is a lack of protection for anti-corruption activists. Threats against civil society organizations and individuals is well known. The deaths of anti-corruption activists is also global knowledge. Such groups are often subjected to intimidation, harassment, loss of employment, and even loss of life. While there is global solidarity for such situations, most often such individuals find themselves in a lonely, dark corner. Do they have the resources to protect themselves against corrupt giants? What kind of protection is there? Is a protection offered timelessly and proactively? Is there adequate resources to provide protection to thousands of people, not only within South Africa, but globally as well? So basically, the question is, do we need a higher level of preparedness and capacity for those that intend to blow the whistle? Another factor is failing to achieve justice. When laws and standards to prevent corruption fail, justice should not follow suit. Often a weak judicial system promotes a perception that corruption does not pay. The risks of being caught and penalized are insufficient. However, the question is, how effective is our law enforcement and justice systems to prosecute and adjudicate corruption cases? Are our justice systems independent enough and free from undue political influence? If this is the case, then does civil society have the tools to demand justice without fear of the consequences? As shown in the diagram to the right, public perceptions is basically sitting at 43.1%, relating that it is pointless to report on corruption because nobody cares at all. Now, if this is a pervasive perception amongst a growing majority of people, then it is a cause for concern. If nobody cares, is there going to be any initiative to take the next step forward? Sometimes the adage, if you can't beat them, join them, may become the prompting force. If you could move to the next slide, Deki. Another growing factor is the procurement processes. If you look at that figure, the highest type of corruption within the South African situation is relating to procurement. Here we've got broad-based Black economic empowerment. We've got the Public Procurement Act. We've got contracts, systems and processes in place, but there is still a growing belief that there is collusion between government officials and big organizations in terms of an exchange of resources to be able to procure private resources for public services. it begs the question, if we've got such legislations, such systems and processes in place to ensure that procurement processes adhere, then why is corruption growing or so high in this particular category relating to procurement? The International Federation of Accountants alluded to what has to be done in policy objectives as shown in the next figure. If we could move to the next one, please. This organization, the International Federation of Accountants, have actually suggested various mechanisms to look at how one can improve the procurement processes. And 70% is directed towards transparency to the public. But here again, it goes back to policies and procedures actually directing towards these various aspects reflected in the diagram in terms of transparency, in terms of fair dealing, in terms of ethical practices. If such systems and processes are in place, then something is amiss in terms of such actions not being adhered to. If you could move to the next slide, please. Another factor is a need for international standards and rules. While one may speak about the commendable work that's being done by Transparency International, the World Bank, and so forth, I think there needs to be a greater sense of engagement between the various institutional organizations like tax authorities, licensing organizations, who can actually exchange information and also bring to light such violations so that there are processes which allow for the repatriation of the freezing of stolen assets that have crossed international borders. The other factor is a lack of whistleblower safeguards, which I've actually mentioned too, but I just wanted to give you two examples with regard to the Zondo Commission and the state capture scenario that's going on. At that commission, there were two individuals, Ethel Williams and Bianca Goodson, that actually spoke about the plight and the pain that they are enduring as state witnesses and the threats that they have been subjected to. Judge Zondo did indicate the need for greater protection. But here again, the Protected Disclosures Amendment Act of 2017, the PDA, speaks at great length in terms of protecting employees against occupational detriment, against harassment. But if the effectiveness was actually enjoyed by these two witnesses, then why have they lost employment? Why have they been targeted? Are whistleblowers protected enough? Is the law providing adequate protection while it is purporting that in legislation? The next factor is in terms of research, and I think there is plenty of research in terms of what is happening across the globe, what is happening in Africa, but that research needs to be translated. It needs to be contextualized. It needs to be looked at in terms of identifying best practices, identifying what is really not going to work in country A or in South Africa, but may very well work in Uganda. So the contextualized complexities actually calls for more research that is more specific to specific environments within not necessarily the African continent, but globally as well. The other factor is audit institutions. These institutions play a critical role, but these institutions as well, if I could just refer to the auditor's report of 2019 and 2020, where threats were made against the Auditor General staff who were involved in compiling corruption reports against 2 municipalities in South Africa. In fact, the audit teams had to be withdrawn and law enforcement agencies engaged because of the threats to the lives of the audit teams who had visited these 2 municipalities and reported on the corruption. So are these individuals, in fact, who are actually doing their work protected as well? So protection actually goes beyond the actual witness. It goes even beyond the individuals who are performing their jobs from an audit perspective. And that is actually impacting on work progress, is impacting on the morale of individuals, and it's also impacting on taxpayers' money, where audit teams need to be withdrawn and brought back, or the work environment needs to be changed in order to safeguard their presence. The other factor is the monitoring and sanctions and incentives. Here as well, while one speaks about the importance of monitoring, are the sanctions adequate enough against those individuals who have been brought to task? Are there incentives to encourage people within the work environment to motivate them to behave ethically, to motivate them to be able to identify deviation from procedures? Okay, these are some of the factors that I have actually looked at. I know they are multiple and they extend well beyond some of these factors, but I thought that these would be pertinent ones that would create some kind of awareness with regard to why corruption is growing within the continent and even within South Africa. Deki, if you could move to the next slide.
Yes, I'm gonna do that just to remind you that you have 5 minutes left, please.
Wow. Okay. Okay, what is the role of anti-corruption institutions? Now, in South Africa, I'm going to quickly squiz through this. We have innumerable number of anti-corruption institutions. I'm not going to mention them. They are on the slide. If you could move to the next one. Such slides are actually supported with a number of institutions as well that are working very closely or in alignment with the various laws. If you could move to the next one, please. And apart from that, we also have a civil society working with government organizations as monitoring or anti-corruption or watch organizations. If you could move to the next one. Thank you. And that refers to the various laws that are linked to monitoring and curbing or mitigating corrupt activities in South Africa. Move to the next one, please. But the barriers that are actually facing these organizations is firstly in-country institutional shortcomings in terms of overlapping of mandates between these various organizations, one not knowing which one should take the lead and which one is going to be the reporting and what is the boundaries of reporting or investigation of specific institutions. Also the lack of independence, and linked to the lack of independence is the political interference, as I alluded to the Constitution of South Africa, speaking to freedom of speech and freedom of association, but to what extent are these boards of directors within state-owned enterprises? To what extent are these anti-watch corruption organizations totally independent from crucification by various organizations that have been set up by government specifically to handle or monitor the activities of such organizations? And thirdly, one needs to look at the ineffective or weak laws and practices. So if you look at the diagram on the right, you would find that there is a growing case, growing cases of those that have been accused of corruption within specifically the National Prosecuting Authority. This body in itself is responsible for overseeing and handling corruption cases within the South African environment. But here as well, individuals have been identified and charged for corrupt activities. The next slide, please. Okay, the other factor is, I think, a very important factor that in terms of hindering the work is a desperation for services. There are long queues, there's inefficiency of services, lack of capacity, and hence you find that individuals are really desperate, and many of them have actually indicated that they have been prepared to pay a bribe in order to access essential services. If you could move to the next slide. The other factor is the perceptions of nepotism and clientelism, and this is obviously a common factor that pervades the brokering of services between the public sector, private sector, as well as within the public sector itself in terms of supporting or patronizing particular groups. And with regard to limited citizen participation, Afrobarometer reported that there is a growing perception that the freedom for citizen participation in various imbizos or civic forums is actually diminishing. The last factor is, has corruption become part of cultures? I think this has to be looked at from various perspectives. And if one looks at the WASTA, the system of building good relations based on personal relationships and networks, based on that belief, it is not regarded as corrupt to exchange gifts. That is also linked to the Diansky system of gift giving in the Chinese environment. And here again, if one looks at the JP Morgan case of corruption in China, the exchange of illicit gifts or a granting of jobs to individuals within the JP Morgan Bank in China, that was raised as a corruption case. But here again, within the cultural perspective, it was regarded as a need to build good communications and networks. Also, another important factor is that as it becomes part of the tradition of a nation and culture, or is it part of the culture of a team, group, or company that are actually at cross purposes and influences the nature of corruption within the organization and within the country. Thank you. Sorry, I had to really squeeze through the last part. Apologies.
Thank you very much, Professor Dorasamy, for this brilliant presentation showing the audience the state of corruption in South Africa. You have pointed out 15 key points that you think are showing why corruption is a problem in South Africa and maybe in many other African countries as well. And the questions that you raised on each of those specific points were very interesting. We have some questions from the audience on some of your elements, but we're going to bring them when we reach the Q&A sessions. I'm going to now turn the floor to Professor Makara from Makara University. The audience read the biography of Professor Makara. Is a professor at Makara University in political science and has worked a lot on the issue of corruption. Professor Makara, the floor is yours. You are on mute. You are on mute. You are still on mute, Professor. Good.
Okay.
No, he's got back again.
Oh, you're no, you're still on mute, Professor.
Now he's
There
back.
you go. Oh. No.
Am I okay?
No.
You were okay, but you keep turning it. You should take the microphone should show up, and like that's now you're
Right
fine.
now,
Don't
just
touch
stay
anything.
like that.
Talk.
Yes. Go ahead.
Am I okay?
Yes, you are.
I'm very sorry for confusion at the beginning, but I'm very happy to join you in the meeting and talk about this very important issue of corruption. And very much, I will talk about mainly on Uganda, although I may have to make some general statements about Africa. In terms of generality, I think that Africa as a whole suffers from a problem of corruption because of two related issues. One, I think the colonial context seems to have set the stage for grand corruption in our African continent. And two, the post-colonial elites who inherited the colonial state apparatus have not done better, but have done worse in terms of corruption. This is not to say that corruption was not there in Africa before colonialists came, but one obvious thing is that the colonial system from top down was really corrupt. And sadly, I think that the post-colonial leaders did not do anything much to change the situation. And in recent years, I think we have seen a lot of regimes in Africa which have taken power, one through military means, and those military regimes never care whether there is sanity in the state or not. Secondly, other regimes like those which seek longevity in power tend to use all means and largely corrupt means to keep themselves in power. Hence the patron-client relations that tend to prevail in some of these regimes that we have around. And specifically in these regimes, we have those so-called liberation regimes, such as South Africa, Angola, Uganda, Rwanda, and so on. Of course, we shall exclude Rwanda to some extent, but some of the so-called liberation regimes tend to go toward the side of corruption. Why? Because they think that the state belongs to them and they have a legitimate reason to privatize it or to squander everything that is in the state. One of the factors that is connected with the liberation regimes, especially the recent ones in the last 20 or so years, has been the fact that first of all, they came with anti-corruption tendencies or anti-corruption ideologies, which most of these regimes have since abandoned because of two factors. One, they want to appease the elites and their cronies who are aligned to them. And two, because they want to seek elections, not because they believe in democratization so much, but because they think that elections can actually legitimize them in power. Therefore, they use all means, including corruption, to stay around. The other associated point with these regimes is the issue of privatization versus public enterprise. When most of these regimes came to power in the 1990s, they were influenced so much by the World Bank and other international organizations to privatize the public enterprises. There were good reasons for privatization of public enterprises, largely because most of them were not performing well at all. They were draining resources from the state. But then privatization seems to have been worse. Why was it worse? Because it cushioned the new elites by way of making private capital out of state enterprises. And that kind of privatization of the state has continued in other areas because public enterprises are now fewer, or most of them are already done. And therefore they have found other ways of entrenching corrupt tendencies through what they call authorities. This is a regulatory authority, the other regulatory authority, and so on, where they siphon resources for themselves and possibly for their relatives. But also they staff some of these agencies with their own relatives. Therefore, it has become, specifically in Uganda, it has become extremely difficult for the government to do something about regularizing of authorities in a way that is clean, that can really be clean or can lead to good performance. Most of the regulatory authorities are really doing poorly in terms of management, performance management, because they are staffed by cronies of the elites, and therefore corrupt tendencies are entrenched, and the meritocracy has been put aside because of political convenience. But also some of our societies, also like the Ugandan society, has suffered from what I may call moral decay at various levels, at social levels, at political level, and also at economic level. Really in Uganda, when you talk about corruption as a key issue in elections, no one cares, because society has gotten accustomed to the fact that whoever takes the state takes it for himself or herself. And therefore, people believe that even if you are coming with a moral agenda, their moral agenda is not going to work, because they think you are going to be like the other one. There is a catchword in Kenya which says, it's my turn now to eat. I think in Uganda, the turns have been, for those who are connected with the state, it is really getting close. As you get closer to the state, the issue is not to serve, but the issue is to really eat. The word eat means really taking a portion of public resources for yourself and maybe for your relatives and friends. The state of Uganda since the mid-90s has made serious strides towards creation of anti-corruption agencies and institutions. If you look at the Constitution of Uganda and the laws of Uganda, a lot of organizations and institutions have been created to ensure that there is less corruption. Despite that, like one of the panelists said earlier, despite of the creation of state institutions, corruption has continued to grow in this country called Uganda. Some of the state institutions that were created to fight corruption include strengthening of the Office of the Auditor General, who really does a very good job in terms of auditing, creation of the Inspectorate of Government, which is supposed to be an independent body to oversee what happens in government. And recently, the President's Office created another institution called State House Anti-Corruption Agency, which is also trying it tries but doesn't do much. And the Anti-Corruption Court was specifically created to try people who are engaged in corruption and the misappropriation of resources, public resources. The Human Rights Commission was created to see that the people who are aggrieved or aggrieved by the actions of the state officials are dealt with, but we shall recommend and tell you that some of these institutions are not doing very well. We also have the Equal Opportunities Commission. Before I go into the details of these other organizations, we have noted in just recently that the chairperson of the Equal Opportunities Commission was actually arrested and arraigned before courts of law for being corrupt herself, which really is very sad, because if a chairperson of the Equal Opportunities Commission was supposed to be as clean as God, I suppose. But also, as we talk about the creation of institutions of governance and corruption, these institutions have been weakened a lot by the political elites, because the institutions try to do their work, like the Inspectorate of Government, like the Auditor General's office, they've tried to do their work, but the reports are not acted on by the executive. Some of the individuals in the state are culpable in these reports. And because they are culpable in these reports, some of the reports are not acted on. So I think that the executive has weakened the anti-corruption institutions in Uganda. But also there is the issue of leadership. The issue of leadership. We have in Uganda the leadership code, which obliges every leader in a significant position to declare assets at regular intervals and so on to the Inspectorate of Government. But these reports, we have not seen the Inspectorate of Government really working on them or following them up. And some of the leaders who are arrested on account of diversion of public resources or misappropriation of public resources are let free by intervention of the executive at one point or another. Or if they are taken to courts of law, some of them have been let free on the account that the prosecution is very weak. And therefore, the courts of law sometimes have no other alternative but to let them free. The Anti-Corruption Court specifically has tried, but despite that, so there are several allegations that some of the members of the Anti-Corruption Court, maybe the clerks and some other people, really are engaged also in taking bribes, which is really unfortunate because this is a pinnacle of the justice in terms of anti-corruption processes and so on. But also, the leadership in practice seems to be weak because once you have a patron-client leadership, which is really stuck on maintaining power, they simply close eyes on some of the corrupt tendencies as long as you are really supporting their regime, supporting their party. You are let off the hook because they know that the money might also help in the election process or other things of the party. Because if you think about it very closely, the ruling party in Uganda does not have assets that you can touch, put your hands on and say, this party is getting money from business X or business Y, but it's well fueled financially. But besides, I think that in terms of leadership, I think there is also the issue of really fraudulent election. Fraudulent election, the biggest part of it is corruption because everybody, you can say, who wins actually buys his or her way into the positions of power because there are no limits on how much money a person may spend in an election. And in fact, they don't care where you get the money as long as you bribe the voters and get your way. There is only one provision in the Constitution and also in the electoral laws which says that you should not receive so much money from external funders. And I think that is the only forbidden thing, that you should get just a certain amount. I think it is like 400 million Uganda shillings, which is also not very big money in terms of elections. But other than that, people just buy their way into leadership. And once they have bought their way into leadership, they really don't care whether people are corrupt or not, because they themselves come through a fraudulent process whereby they buy themselves into state positions by bribing voters. Well, you could also say that Parliament, despite having those kind of people who join politics through buying themselves, buying the votes, Parliament has tried to do something about corruption. In the past, for example, in the 6th Parliament, for example, which is like 20 years ago, some ministers were censured. But after censuring the ministers, actually the law was tightened because now it is almost extremely difficult to censure a minister in Uganda. And even if he engages in influence peddling, even if he engages or she engages in collusion or something like that, the process is very difficult. Even withdrawing, there used to be laws allowing the citizens or voters to withdraw their mandate from a member of parliament, for example. But these laws have been since amended, and the process of, for example, removing a member of parliament on account of misdeeds or wrongs or corruption or any related matters, the processes are extremely difficult. So politically, we can say that politically, corruption is highly shielded in Uganda. You just have to be on the wrong side of politics for you to be noted or to be taken seriously through the processes of law, for you to be punished. Because I think as far as you are politically connected and well connected, you really get away with it. But in terms of practice of preventing corruption, we see, for example, the whistleblowers are not well protected in this country. Many times you find that those who report corruption, either their report is not worked on, or sometimes they're exposed to their enemies who are engaged in the corrupt practices, and that endangers their lives. And therefore, because it endangers their lives, very few people are willing to sacrifice themselves to report corruption, because they are at a very big risk of being harmed or any kind of thing that may really hinder corruption or at least curtail corruption. But we have so many ways through which many people in Uganda, especially those who are politically connected, business people, and others who are socially influential, can actually engage in corruption. There are a number of ways. For example, money laundering is quite common in this country. You don't know, no one asks you where you get your money. As long as you really become rich, not much is being done. Although the institutions for anti-laundering do exist. Influence peddling and collusion is highly common here, and you cannot be engaged in those two things unless you are politically protected and politically connected. But also, if you look at it very critically, you find that the regimes which are in power recycle corrupt people. You wonder why, or whether there are no sane people in the country, because what you see is that a person X who was accused of, and even proved sometimes in courts of law, to have engaged in corrupt activities, being brought back simply because he used his money or her money and won an election. So recycling proved corrupt people in this country has become a norm rather than an exception. But also the ethics of public service and the public dealings. No one is interested in enforcing them, because if you look at our political education system, we even have National School for Political Education. The issue of corruption and public ethics is not one which is taken seriously. And if you also look at the manifestos of candidates, by the way, not only those who are in power, but also those who are in the opposition, they don't so much talk about corruption when they are campaigning, and you wonder why. The reason is that, first of all, society does not care whether you are corrupt or not. They just want your money so that you give them these bribes for you to be elected. And also, they think that when you go to politics, you are going to be like the other ones. It will be your turn to eat. So we see a situation where really the issue of ethics has generally collapsed. Like our colleague has pointed out in the case of South Africa, procurement departments in government have become the center of corruption, because you can see a good one thing that everybody knows costs only $2 being inflated to $20, $10, and so on, and no one is asking the question, why is this thing that costs $2 on the street costing $20 here? No one cares about that. But also, institutions that should have enforced sanity in terms of ethics of public service, they themselves are regarded as corrupt. The courts of law are ranked by Transparency International as being corrupt themselves. The police, which is supposed to be number one in terms of preventing corruption, is actually number one in terms of being ranked by Transparency International as the most corrupt institution in the country. Now, when it comes to civil society, which is really struggling, civil society organizations have done tremendously well in terms of exposing corrupt activities. Ordinarily, you would think that government would be an ally of civil society in trying to minimize or eradicate corruption. In the last few years, civil society came up with a coalition known as Black Monday Movement, which was protesting against people who are corrupt. To our surprise, actually Black Monday activists were being whipped by the police all over the place, I think with the orders from above and so on. The other institution of society which is really helping to curb corruption is the media, where my friend, young friend, Mr. Mwenda belongs. They have exposed corruption. His papers and other papers and other media have exposed corruption. To our surprise is that the state doesn't seem to follow these well-researched reports by the media. Instead, actually, the media has been going down on some of these critical issues, because some of the media, which is very critical in terms of exposing corruption, has been scattered by the state, so to say. In other words, what I'm saying is that the media, which is very, very vibrant, has been either shut, or the editors have been fined heavily and so on. So there is a lot of self-censorship in the media in Uganda. So maybe only a few people can dare to expose grand corruption, so to say. And we have in Uganda a highly decentralized local government system. When the decentralization process took place in the 1990s, everybody had a hope that now at least corruption would be checked at the lower level. To our surprise, and from various reports of the Auditor General and other researchers, we find that corruption has intensified also at the lower level. Service delivery at the local level is really minimal in terms of district local governments, municipalities, and so on, simply because there is a high level of corruption at those levels. So the aims of decentralization, which was a noble reform of government, have been defeated. And central government has not done much to assist local governments to combat corruption, because the local elites at the local level are the same people who support the elites at the higher level in terms of electoral contestation. And therefore, if you are corrupt at the local level and you are influential in the system of the party, they simply ignore, and you don't see. Even the Inspector General of Government who has branches at several districts and regions, you don't see many reports coming up or the culprits being taken seriously in various places, because it just happens that most of the people who are engaged in corruption are also politically connected seriously. And therefore, the decentralization objectives, which were really part of it, was to really check abuse of power and misappropriation of resources. The ends of that objective have been defeated by corruption at the lower level. This is not to say that corruption is not intensive at the top level, because many of the ministers, many of the top officials of government have been accused of corruption. But not much has been done to correct this bad image and the misappropriation of the resources. But also, the judicial system, which is, as I said earlier, which is supposed to really be a watchdog or to really curtail corruption, has also been partly involved in this corruption scheme, because there is a saying in Uganda today, or an observation in Uganda, that the judges are now called kada judges, meaning that they are connected to the political system. They are cadres of the regime, and therefore, if you happen to be presented in the courts of law and you're a cadre of the government, the cadre judges are likely to rule on you quite leniently, and therefore you may not get a harsh punishment. So there is an allegation that only those people who appear to be on the opposition or are not clearly identified with the ruling party are the ones who are punished seriously by the courts of law themselves. But also we should look at the society itself, the bigger society.
Excuse me, Professor Makara, you still have 3 more minutes.
How many minutes?
3 more.
Maybe 5. We should look at the big picture of our society. Uganda is a country which has come from the doldrums, once ruled by Idi Amin under the military regime, and later on by Obote, where human rights had declined, where corruption was the norm. So you can give a benefit of doubt to the current government that it has tried to put institutions in place. They may not be working sufficiently or efficiently, but they are trying their level best. What happens is that in Uganda, we have 2 types of corruption, maybe also in many other African countries. We have the grand corruption. We also have petty corruption. Both types of corruption, according to Transparency International, are growing in the country, despite existence of institutions check corruption. The grand corruption is growing because people who have access to billions of Uganda shillings really scoop those resources and use them for their personal benefit. If you are people like us who work outside the state, people think that you are a fool. Why don't you go and scoop those resources also? You are qualified. Why don't you go and scoop the resources? That kind of mentality within the public is very dangerous. I think it increases corruption because people are not condemning corruption. They seem to glorify it. But also petty corruption is on the increase because of poverty and poor pay in public service. You have drivers, you have cleaners, you have messengers, and even low cadre public officials who don't have access to grand corruption. They also reward themselves by stealing fuel, by stealing paper in the office, by stealing furniture and so on, and stealing the spare parts of cars and so on. You find so many government cars parked there that they are not functioning simply because the drivers and other people who are working on those cars removed the spares of the cars, and also misusing the cars, maybe carrying their own personal goods on the government cars or using them to build their own houses and so on. This is very dangerous, type of corruption also. But as I conclude, I think the decline of personal ethics, like my colleague pointed out, is very dangerous in our country. People do not value ethics. Even church leaders in my country here are involved in corruption. A university professor like me, some of them are involved in corruption. So whereas we really put a blame on the political leaders and administrative cadres of corruption, I think there are several other members of society or sections of society which are also corrupt, simply because corruption is so widespread and not condemned but glorified. So personal ethics is very, very, very small in my country. But also, I think the state is not helping the situation by making the civil service and public service generally inefficient in terms of service delivery, because resources which are supposed to be providing the public service are diverted with impunity, to the extent that people know that in certain ministries, those ones are called wet ministries, those which have a lot of opportunities for stealing. And those other ministries which have little resources are called dry ministries. And the state is aware that if you are in the other ministry, you are going to steal. And the state does nothing about it. I want to sign off. Thank you for giving me an opportunity. I didn't prepare like my sister has done from South Africa, but next time I'll give you a PowerPoint which might make the presentation much more easier to follow. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Professor Makara. Your presentation was very easy to follow, even though you didn't prepare the PowerPoint slide. It was very brilliant and very informative. Just to summarize, you pointed out an interesting point that may explain why corruption is not declining in Africa, especially in Uganda. One is the colonial context you think that set up the stage for high corruption, and the post-colonial elite behavior seeking for personal rent. You mentioned another number of elements like the political aspect of liberation regimes in many African countries who think that the state belongs to them, the failure of the privatization of the 80s, and the decay of moral and many other points. And your conclusion pointed to the decline of personal ethics as well as the lack of impunity from a state. Thank you very much for that. We will take questions after Mr. Mwenda's presentation. Mr. Mwenda, it's now your time to make your case. Thank you very much. You're on mute, Mwenda. You're on mute, Andrew. You're on mute. Great.
Thank you very much, Deki, for inviting me to speak before this August audience, and I thank the previous panelists for their contribution. First of all, I want to begin by saying that corruption is not one thing. Corruption is so many things. Two, corruption is both a moral, ethical, and legal issue. Of course, the problem is that the legal, ethical, and moral norms vary from society to society and within each society from time to time. There are many things that were considered corrupt in Britain that were considered moral, ethical, and were perfectly legal in Britain in the 19th century and early 20th century, which today are codified both ethically, morally, and legally as corrupt. So we should have that in mind. Because corruption is many things, I will deal with the two levels of corruption. One is what I would call grand corruption at the political level. The other is, that one is, many people would say is driven by greed. I don't agree. And there is a micro corruption of, let's say, the school teacher, of the police officer, the traffic police officer on the street who takes 10,000 Uganda shillings or $3 so that he cannot punish you for a traffic offense. That is a different type of corruption, and it's driven by different things. But there are two broad things we can note about corruption. If you study Africa's post-independence history, every government has come to power promising to fight corruption, whether it was a military coup, a revolutionary movement, an elected government, whatever it is. It came to power promising to fight corruption, and each and every one of those governments left power when it was accused of having practiced corruption, of indulging in corruption. It ruled and left being accused of corruption. So what we can note as a consistency, as a continuity, is corruption has been a consistent part of post-independence politics in Africa without exception. There may be variations in detail, but in the fundamental sense, corruption is present in practically every single post-independence African country. It is rare to find exceptions. If they are there, they are one or two, and they are really exactly that, exceptions. Therefore, I don't think that it makes a lot of sense for us to keep preaching about corruption and how bad it is. We need to understand what is it that makes it resilient, and perhaps question whether our arguments against it are corrupt, or rather are correct. Is it not true that we are using Western lenses to understand politics in Africa? Are we not picking a model out of Britain and the United States, which, by the way, Britain and the United States, France and Belgium, Holland and Sweden and Norway, which they adopted maybe 60, 70 years ago. And they adopted it after they had transformed from agrarian societies into industrial societies. After their public revenues had grown, let's say from $100 per person to $20,000 per person. Is it possible that you can govern a country whose per capita revenue is $150 exactly the same way you govern a country whose per capita expenditure or per capita tax revenue is $20,000? These are the questions we need to ask ourselves. So I want to go to the bolts and nuts of politics as I see it in Uganda. I must add that I have published 2 books on corruption and about 17 academic papers on corruption. And many of them, I no longer agree with my views there. The more I have written about corruption, the more my mind and my views have changed, because I have realized all along, because of, you can look at the books behind me, all of them are written by Western authors, even us African authors, our lenses of examining Africa are using Western lenses. And therefore we don't study Africa as an independent unit of analysis. So for my lecturer, Professor Sabit Makara, who taught me at Makerere University, let us deal with the reality. You are a member of parliament. You want to win an election. What gives you a competitive advantage over your rivals? Is it really your program? And when your constituents elect you, what do your constituents expect of you as a member of parliament? When they have a problem of school fees, they come to you. When somebody has died, you are the one who buys a coffin. When they have to build a local church, they expect you to contribute. When they have somebody in your constituency who needs a job, you are the one who connects them. So to be a successful politician in Africa, in these poor countries, you need to have sufficient resources at your disposal to help your constituents, your relatives and kin, your campaign managers and others to be able to access resources. That is what makes you an effective politician. How do you accumulate those resources? Of course, if you're in a government, you must use public resources to accumulate those resources. And if you do that, that's what is considered corrupt. You're using your public office to accumulate private resources. But are these really private resources? Because often members of parliament use resources to build political networks of support. But also, if you are a president and a ruling party, how in a country like Ghana, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Democratic Republic of Congo with 600 tribes, Uganda with 50 tribes, Tanzania with about 250. How does the central state build infrastructure of legitimacy in the different ethno-regional communities and religious communities that constitute a polity called Tanzania? So this brings me to the crux of my argument. One, that corruption is not a technical problem that needs a technical fix, which is the plethora of institutions every African country has put in place. It's also not a technical problem in need of logistics and a budget and a political will. Corruption is a particular form of politics and authority that is tailor-made for poor countries. In fact, I must add that the rich countries of the Western world that we see today, when they are the same per capita income as us, when they are the same per capita revenue as us, when they were the same per capita expenditure as us, they governed through the non-trusted and tested means of managing power relations in a poor society, that is clientelism, patronage, and repression. And I think that these methods of governance are not, when we criminalize certain acts, we are actually criminalizing normal politics in a poor society. These are not pathologies. They are responses. They are legitimate, and I think realistic, cost-effective, cost-efficient, and affordable mechanisms of managing power relations in a resource-constrained environment. A lot of anti-corruption laws, therefore, tend to criminalize legitimate politics in poor countries. They also criminalize the only affordable means of managing power relations. And these anti-corruption institutions are therefore an indulgence in self-deceit. It is African elites lying to themselves that they are going to cut the hand that feeds the system, that they are going to suck the grease out of the wheels. Corruption is the wheel, is the grease that turns the wheels of politics. If you remove it, I don't think many of these states in poor countries can survive. Now, the other point I want to make is that, you see, once you understand that a lot of the politicians who take money out of the public purse, they do not take it primarily in pursuit of self-aggrandizement. Those who do it are an exception. But self-aggrandizement, economic aggrandizement seems to be the most visible form in which we can understand corruption. I personally think that the biggest driver of corruption is taking public resources out of the state to a private person's use, not for private use necessarily. A lot of it goes to build these political networks. So not as a form of agreement, as a form of building political coalitions, a governing and electoral coalition. The main aim is to build a clientele of support, not necessarily to build a personal house, even if that is another side effect. Corruption is where the central government leaders are able to placate the interests of diverse and heterogeneous ethnic and religious communities in our countries, and therefore be able to link the state to their different constituents. I am even inclined to believe it is wrong for us to say that a politician who takes money out of the public purse is taking it for private use, because this assumes that this private use and the public needs of the state of Uganda are contradictory. In fact, I think they are fused. Take an example of Yoweri Museveni, and Makara knows this. How does Yoweri Museveni ensure that the different constituent parts of Uganda remain a part of Uganda? He will appoint a minister from West Nile. There are many tribes there, Lugubar, Madi, and whatever. But when he appoints them, what is his aim? The aim is that minister acts as a bridge between him, the NRM, and the state of Uganda to that community. If the minister steals, he shares with his community, and that's what legitimizes the state of Uganda. And what therefore we call corruption is the way through which the state of Uganda becomes legitimate in the eyes of different elites in different ethnic communities. Without it, those elites are likely to opt out of the area called Uganda. Professor Makara would agree with me that there was a time when the northern region of Uganda was excluded from power. They did not have many ministers eating. And there was talk of secession by the north. We need to secede and have our own place where we can eat. Now, the more the ministers are appointed from there, the more they get a sense of belonging, and they become the agents of the state of Uganda to legitimize the state of Uganda, to build the legitimacy of the state of Uganda in their communities. So when they steal this man out of the public purse, when they help their relatives, constituents, and others get jobs without following a meritocracy, are they acting out of public interest or the public interest of Uganda? I want to argue that the public interest of Uganda oftentimes, not all the time, but most of the time, is served through these private networks. And therefore, the creation of a dichotomy between the private and the public is using Western lenses to look at African politics. Even when I come at lower level corruption of a small police officer, a teacher, a nurse in a hospital, I don't think their corruption, and then in fact, it's their corruption that allows a set function. Again, I want to speak to my former professor, Makara. A police officer in Uganda is paid a salary of $500,000 shillings, which is about $150. If he stays in Kampala, has a wife and 3 kids, can he survive on that salary? He cannot. Because he cannot survive on that salary, it is corruption that allows him to remain in his job and therefore serve the public interest of Uganda to ensure that there is some degree of traffic policing, of whatever criminal investigation, whatever functions of the state that are served because he is able to supplement his salary using private means. Let me say, a person could say, pay them a living wage. Can Uganda afford a living wage? I did a study and said, let us pay every teacher in Uganda a living wage. This was 2015. My budget for the Ministry of Education in Uganda became 21 trillion, but the total budget of the government of Uganda was 19. So to pay a living wage, which was really basic, to meet the basic needs, pay rent, buy food, was more than what Uganda, for teachers alone in the whole of Uganda, was more than what Uganda spends. I'll give you a simple statistic example. This financial year, if you get total budget of Uganda divided by the total population, you get $194 per person for a whole year. If you get the total budget of the US divided by total population, you get $21,000, 750. That is the budget of last year, not the one of Biden, but the one of Trump, 2020. The total budget is $21,000, $21,750. Uganda, it's just $194. Let me ask you, ladies and gentlemen, is it possible for Uganda and the United States to govern using similar governance strategies, given the resources available, even before we talk about culture? Is it possible to govern a society with $20,000 per capita spending and $200 per capita spending in the same way? I don't think so. So, because the government of Uganda cannot afford to pay public sector wages, the only way the public sector can work is if those officials can find alternative sources of income to supplement the official income. And I think that without those alternatives, they would not work for the state and the public sector would collapse. So their corruption is not injurious to the interests of the nation and the public. In fact, I think it's complementary to it. Please remember that what I'm speaking are heresies. I know very few people would agree with me, but I am really convinced that what I'm touching is realistic, not idealistic. So I want to argue that corruption does not exist because of bad people. Rather, it's a product of many compromises with many that the state makes with many of its potential opponents. And a lot of what it does is allows the state to function. That is micro corruption and grand corruption. Most of it is what allows the project of national building and state consolidation in poor societies. And I'm even encouraging in this belief when I studied the history of the United States, when it had the same per capita spending as Uganda, that the United States government had the same per capita spending as Uganda in 1864. 1864, when Abraham Lincoln was president. And I can tell you, study the administration of Abraham Lincoln, you will find that the Museveni strategies, Uhuru Kenyatta strategies, the late Magufuli strategies, whichever African president you can talk about, their strategies and those of the leaders of Europe and North America are the same at the time when they had the same per capita spending were quite similar. The differences would be in degree of detail. I think what sustains corruption in our part of the world is the fact that it is a widely accepted currency of managing politics. And Sabit Makara hinted on it. If he went back to his village, people say, why are you not joining the government? You are a highly qualified man. Why are you just in the government? Because the public expected that. Professor Makara knows that around about 1996, there were many public-spirited individuals in the parliament of Uganda. In every election of Uganda, public-spirited individuals either opt out or are defeated. And people who are more crooked join politics. Why is it that every election increases the share of crooked politicians against public-spirited individuals? Our friend from South Africa has given us statistics which show that corruption has been increasing, not reducing, since Black people were given a chance at democracy, and they represent a very poor constituency. Why? South Africa, my friend, is not an oddity. It is following the footpath of other African countries, but it's not just Africa. Look at Burma. Look at let me give you an example of India. In 2014, India has a parliament of 554 members, 545 members, 645 members. In 2014, they had 2,100 candidates for parliament. Of those, 700 had a criminal charge against them. Out of 545, not 600, out of 545 members of parliament who were elected, 167 had a criminal charge against them. That is 1/3. Of those, 78 were accused of heinous offenses, which include rape, murder, robbery. And listen to the final one, 33 were elected from jail. Now, the Carnegie Endowment did a study in 2017, and this is what they found. They found that in every election, the number of criminals in the Parliament of India goes up by 3%. 3%. They also found that if you're a criminal, you have a 3 times higher chance of winning than an honest politician. India is the most long-lasting stable democracy in a poor country. It gives us a very good idea of what happens, of what kind of politics you have in a poor country. What kind of politics you get in a poor country. There is a book by an American journalist called Denya. I need to remember the other name. Stephen Denya. The book is called Rogue Elephant, Harnessing the Potential of India's Unruly Democracy. And he has a lot of, he travels across India during elections and he finds politicians who are crooked, who have stolen. When they have stolen in New Delhi, when they go back to their home states, Gujarat, Punjab, Kerala, whatever you call it, Uttar Pradesh, and they go to their villages, the community receives them as heroes. Professor Makar would agree with me, many of the most corrupt politicians in Uganda always get re-elected, and they're the most respected members of that community because the community sees them as people who help. They provide fees, they provide different forms of assistance to their constituents. And this is the moral universe of all poor peasant societies. So, in other words, if we have to understand corruption, if we have to put institutions in a place to fight corruption, we must define what is the corruption we want to talk about. But a lot of the corruption that has been codified by Western countries is actually a criminalization of normal politics in a poor country. It is a criminalization of the aspirations of ordinary people. What Africa and other poor countries need is to build an institutional architecture that reflects a legal system that reflects their moral values. There is an amazing paper written by a Nigerian scholar called Peter Ike. It is called Colonialism and the Two Publics in Africa. It was written in 1975. It's such a brilliant piece of work, which shows you that a lot of the things we call corruption, if they were not to function, Nigeria cannot hold together. I don't think that if you sucked corruption, if you use the Western definition of corruption in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Uganda, in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Zambia, in Malawi, I would even say even Botswana, you would retain normal politics. I want to conclude by saying that what I'm saying, of course, has what I would call divergences. There would be exceptions and even counter narratives. But if you hold a string of thought and hold it together, you would find that corruption is the way the system in Africa works, or in poor countries works, not the way it fails. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for this interesting presentation and throwing out your view on corruption in Africa and in Uganda. So your point is mainly that the situation of corruption is a reflection of African politics, and without that way of doing, African politics will be something different. So corruption in Africa should not be seen from Western lenses. We're gonna now start taking some questions from the audience, but I will first put forward some questions that we receive from in a written form. And these questions are for all the panelists. Question number one is from Professor Dorasami's presentations. You pointed out that the principal agent model in South Africa explained part of corruption. But the question is that really be going to help address corruption in the context of South Africa? The other comment we receive is that increasing the pay of public servants in Africa will reduce the proportion of the tendency for corruption. The person who sent the comment would like to hear from the panelists on whether increasing working conditions for public servants is a way of reducing corruption. So let's start with those two questions, and then we're going to take some other from the audience, please. Thank you. You are on mute, Professor Sami. You are on mute. You are on mute.
Right, perfect. Sorry about that. With regard to the principal agent approach, I think the point that I was trying to make there is that you got to have a clean system, you got to have a clean agent, and you got to have a clean principal. And I think those three constructs have to work in synergy to ensure that that principal agent approach is going to work. And more especially from, I think, a decentralized perspective. Because, for example, if you're looking at the Central Ministry of Finance that has devolved powers to, let's say, the Auditor General in terms of conducting audits across the country. If there are corrupt teams operating within the Auditor General's office, then obviously you would find that the agent is not carrying out the mandate of the Minister of Finance or National Treasury. In the same vein, if the system or even the ministry, the national ministry, has corrupt tendencies, then the agent would not be able to execute their task in view of directives that are coming from the national office. So I think those three constructs have to work in harmony to be able to ensure that that principal agent approach works. I hope I've answered that question. The other question, Deki, I don't know if I got it right. You are looking at if you improve the working conditions of public servants, with corruption decrease?
Yes.
I don't think corruption ought to be linked to working conditions. You have chosen to be an employee of the public sector, and coming with that contract of employment are working conditions that are determined by the Public Service Act and the Public Service Code of Conduct and so forth. There is no excuse, whether you're in the public sector or in the private sector, and whether you are doing a mediocre job or a high-profile job, that even the salaries should be a determining factor in terms of whether you should be inclined towards corruption or not. It is the personal ethics that ought to be at the forefront in terms of you executing your duties as a public servant. And in executing your duties as a public servant, you need to make a choice. Align your personal ethics with the organizational ethics. And if you cannot cope or manage with the, let's say, the low salaries in the public sector, which is a reality across Africa and in many parts of the world because of the non-profit and profit modus operandi that operates in contrast between the two environments, then it's a choice that you have to make to quit and join the private sector, where generally you would find a higher salary scale and better working conditions. So I cannot, or I will not concede to corruption decreasing because of poor working conditions, because then the personal ethics is not at the forefront of you as a public sector employee. Thank you.
I don't know. Thank you, Professor Sam. I don't know if Professor Makara has some comments on those 2 points. You are on mute, Professor. We can't hear you.
Is that okay now?
Yes, please.
I want to comment on the issue of salaries. On the question of salaries, I think like in Uganda, we have a system of salary administration which is very selective and discriminatory. if you look at the salaries of political leaders in Uganda, compared to the traditional civil servants, you just can't understand what happens, because even senior administrative cadres do complain because the politicians pay themselves very well. They give themselves medical allowances, they give themselves cars, they give themselves all kinds of benefits. But when it comes to civil servants, they are not considered seriously in terms of their welfare. I think the case of Uganda is quite exceptional, because even people who would have personal ethics, I think to some extent they fail to abide by the personal ethics, because the conditions can be so depressing that they find themselves engaged in corruption. But also, on the other hand, you find that some institutions which pay fairly well, like the regulatory authorities I was mentioning earlier on, even in those regulatory authorities where salaries are reasonably way better, actually there is corruption. So we cannot have one yardstick which says if the people are paid well, they'll be less corrupt. But also when the salaries are extremely low and other benefits are very low, people tend to compare themselves with those they went to school with. And they say, but we are doing the same job for government. Why is it that the other one, who is a politician, is very well remunerated? And for me, I'm a teacher or a doctor, I'm poorly paid. That question really stays with us. I don't know the direct answer, but I think it's a very, very unfortunate circumstance.
Thank you, Professor Makara. We have some other questions from the audience. Let me start with Mr. Mwenda. There are people who agree with your reflection on politics and corruption in Africa. Questions are, number one, in the case of Uganda, is that way of patronage has created more equality or inequality? One. Second, your reference to the US in terms of comparison, in terms of per capita. Do you think that is a fair comparison? Number three, given the inequality created by patronage politics in Uganda, a multicultural country, how can equality or every Ugandan be given same opportunity if it doesn't belong to an ethnic group whose member of parliament or whose person is in the parliament? You are on mute.
Could you please repeat these questions for me? Because I thought it would be one, there are three, and I'm too old to remember things.
You're still too young, Andrew. Question number one, the way you describe corruption in Uganda as a normal thing for given Ugandan politics, it has created more inequality. So how do you create equality in that context? Number two, do you think your comparison to the US in terms of per capita to justify the level of corruption in Uganda is fair?
And what was the third question?
Yeah, I think the third question was, how do you make Uganda an inclusive society given the description of corruption and politics you gave?
Now, let me begin with the first question about income inequality. I do not know the study of income inequality in Uganda and the relationship between the two. It's very difficult for me to tell. But what I know is that corruption is in many times redistributive, even though in unfair ways, because to be a successful politician, as I argued, you need to accumulate resources and share these resources with a large network of your people. A politician who is mean will not succeed in politics. To be a powerful personage from Busoga or from among the Kikuyu or the Kalenjin like Ruto, you must have sufficient resources and you must use those resources to lubricate your co-ethnics. If you don't, you will not last long in politics. So it has that redistributive effect. And I think that is why Professor Makara, his constituents complain, they say, but you man, you are highly educated. Why are you in the private sector? You can go to government now. Government salaries are not very high. I'm sure they expect him to go to government, get a share of the loot, take it to them and share with them. And he'll be very successful if he has shared. If he doesn't share and he eats alone, he knows he will not live long in parliament. One of the problems we have in Uganda is that we have a high anti-incumbency bias. We had a parliament of 464 MPs, only 107 were re-elected. 70% were kicked out because they did not share much. The public expectations are so high, but the resources available to MPs are very low. I don't even agree that they are paid too much money. I think MPs in Uganda paid too little money given the responsibilities they have to shoulder on their personal income from their constituents. The second, I brought the comparison of Uganda and the United States to demonstrate that how you govern a society is dependent on history, on culture and other things. But a very critical factor in governance strategies is finances. Countries like Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, all poor countries you know in the world cannot derive legitimacy from providing a large basket of public goods and services impersonally to all citizens, as we expect from Max Weber legal rational state of the Western world. For you to govern, for any state to secure legitimacy, using the legal, rational, formal structure of the state we see in the West, where public support for the state or the legitimacy of the state is derived from the delivery of a large basket of public goods and services, requires one important factor: revenues. Poor countries do not have the revenues to govern using that governance model. So what poor countries do, they govern using cheaper and affordable means and strategies. And those are patronage, clientelism, and repression. And I want to argue that repression, patronage, and clientelism are long-tested, trusted, used methods of managing power relations in poor societies. Even Belgium, even Norway, even Britain, when it was at the same level of revenue as Uganda, it was governed exactly as Museveni does. The differences would be in degree or detail, but fundamentally, go read your history. The governance model would be the same. The final thing, how do you make the Ugandan system inclusive? Professor Makara made this point. Not decentralized service delivery. That was only one part. We also decentralized the corruption. So we have democratized the corruption in Uganda and ensured that every ethnic community, every village has access to the state patronage pie. And that's why this country has been stabilized, because you have this flabby and heterogeneous coalition of multi-ethnicities who come to the state in search of particularistic advantage. And now the net has been spread wide. Every village has been made a district, and every district has a budget, and all those budgets are creating patronage for local elites in those communities. In that way, Uganda's corruption is inclusive.
Thank you very much. We may come back to some questions because there is a disagreement on your view on corruption and politics in Uganda. Some people in the audience claim that it does not contribute to social development economic because some ethnic groups are benefiting from what you describe. And I think Professor Makara may comment on that. The point I want to make is that we don't know if the webinar was set for to end at 1 p.m., but we don't know if it's gonna cut abruptly. Otherwise, we will continue. But before we end, we have 2 more minutes from the regular time. Question to Professor Doraisamy. There's one member of the audience.
Deki, just to worry, it doesn't end automatically at 1 o'clock, so you can continue running the questions. I checked. I was able to check.
Okay, so we can take 15 more minutes for the discussion.
No problem.
Okay, thank you very much, Bruce. So Andrew, we're gonna come back to you. Let me bring the question to Professor Doraisamy. A few members in the audience claim that, or want to know your view on the point that is not the South African judicial or legal system also under state capture, which is also explaining why corruption is in the society. You are on mute, Professor.
Sorry, the first part is the South African judiciary not under state capture.
Yes.
And the second part?
That is the question. The whole legal system or the judicial system is under state captures, which is also part of, which is also explaining why corruption is very high, given your example of corruption in public procurement.
Okay, I think the evidence is partially there and the evidence is not there. And hence, you could say that it's under partial, if I could say, capture, and alternatively, I could say, you know what, there is really not a total state capture. The reason being, if you're looking at Judge Zondo, who is currently chairing the Zondo Commission regarding the state capture, there was a call by former President Zuma to have him recused in view of previous allegations of conflict between the two individuals. But despite that, the case of the call was not strong enough, and he continued chairing or presiding over that commission. But there have been other incidences where you would find, like the Bosasa incident, where I have indicated that the one of the magistrates was found guilty of accepting or allegedly accepting bribes with regard to security improvements for personal gain. So complete state capture, I would say no, but cases of partial state capture or under the influence of the executive and the legislative, there have been cases. But I don't think they have rescinded totally their kind of role in terms of exercising a justice system against criminality in South Africa.
Thank you very much. Question to you, Professor Makara. I know you may have some comments from to Mr. Mwenda's explanation of the situation of corruption in Uganda. One of the questions the audience wanted to address is, what kind of incentives will be there to make those anti-corruption institutions work very well with to extract them from the political influence of political elite?
Well, I think that the government of Uganda had very noble intentions to create these anti-corruption institutions. What worries me that there is a decline in the performance of the anti-corruption institutions. And because of the decline, people's trust and confidence in these institutions has also declined. And once the people's trust in these institutions declines, it's very dangerous for the country. It's dangerous because people have no recourse to where they can go when they detect corruption, or they detect the abuse of power, or they detect wrongdoing in society. I think that is a decline of the whole country. Once institutions of anti-corruption decline, it signifies or denotes the decline of the whole society. Because you see, when these institutions were erected by the government or put in place by government, people had a hope that a country that was once in the doldrums is resurrecting and trying to rebuild itself. And once these institutions now are going down, people are desperate. They don't know what to do next. It also ties in with the issue of democratization. When we got the government that is in power presently, it had very good ideologies of anti-corruption, anti-sectarianism, anti-sectarianism, anti-discrimination, and so on. That's why these institutions were put in place. But I think, to a large extent, the government has abandoned these institutions because, like my friend Mwenda is putting it, the government sees that these institutions, if they are made to work perfectly, it would not favor them, it would not favor the government, because it is the very government people who are engaged in corruption. And therefore, if some of these people are culpable, are held culpable by these institutions, it does not work in their interest. So the system of corruption has become systemic, so to say. And because it's now systemic, the people who are holding power think like my friend Mwenda is thinking, that actually leave corruption to stay, because corruption is good for us, stay in power. I think that's a very dangerous trend of things. It gives the young people no hope, because the young people in the universities and colleges are saying that if there was no corruption, if the resources were not being stolen by these political elites, we would have jobs, or our parents would have better pay, so that would also improve our welfare. More women would be, like the other person who asked the question about inclusiveness, more youth and more women would be included in welfare programs and the improvement of their lives, their lives, and eradication of poverty and so on. But these programs are put in place, the money is stolen, so government raises so many billions of Uganda shillings, and the resources never reach the beneficiaries. And when my friend argues like that, I don't understand what he's saying precisely. And my friend Mwenda, knows that there is a good example of Rwanda, which is a neighboring country, where corruption has been minimized. In fact, Rwanda ranks amongst the best countries in the taming corruption in Africa, below the 20 first countries, amongst the 20 best countries in Africa in terms of controlling corruption. And the indicators of service delivery in Rwanda speak for themselves. People access medicine in hospital, people access a doctor in a hospital, people access a teacher, professors are fairly well paid. And that indicates that if corruption was actually controlled even in a country like Uganda, which has more resources than Rwanda, service delivery would be better for the ordinary person, and therefore the system of inclusiveness would be much better. I don't know why my friend argues like that.
Mr. Mwenda, we still have 7 more minutes before to end the webinar. Briefly, would you like to respond to Professor Makara? And one other question is the audience, that why do you justify that explanation of corruption politics in Africa or in Uganda, knowing that the service delivery you claim to say it's supporting is a failure?
First of all, let me answer the last question of Professor Makara. You see, to change a society so quickly from its existing values may require circumstances of such extraordinary scale, such a level of devastation, that a society gets shocked into change in its values. I think that what happened in Rwanda is in 1994, they had such a comprehensive destruction of the state, the economy, and dissolution of the society, that I think the Rwandans realize that what they face are not tactical or even strategic threats, they face existential threats. And therefore the society can accept to impose upon them a strict regime of particular forms of compliance because of the nature of the devastation they went through. And therefore you cannot transplant that experience of Rwanda onto Uganda. That is one. But even President Kagame in Rwanda would tell you it is not that there is no corruption in Rwanda. What you'd say is there is no corruption with impunity. It's not, you cannot steal money and walk free like it happens in Uganda. The final point I wanted to answer on Rwanda is that you see Rwanda is a uni-ethnic society. They are one tribe, one culture, one language, one history. And Rwanda is one of those states in Africa that was not created by colonialism. The state of Rwanda existed before colonialism. In fact, with larger borders than today. So it already has some historical legitimacy. The state of Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, Ghana, Nigeria was a hotspot of so many ethnic communities that were indifferent to one another, hostile to one another, or even unaware of each other's existence, and then were crafted together. Not even governed as one society until at independence. Then our leaders were handed this fiction of a state. So a lot of the leaders of many African countries have to build a state from the basic foundation. How does a person like Museveni integrate the Karamojong, the Madi, the Lugbar, the Kakwa, the Samia, the Bagwere, the Banyole, the Bagisu, the Kumam, the Teso? I mean, there's so many tribes before you reach his home village. When he speaks to Ugandans, only maybe 1/3 or 40% of Ugandans can understand what he's saying. The others can't understand it. How does the state of Uganda legitimate itself in those other communities which don't even share your language, don't share your culture? So, I have given an example of India, which is the best example. To bring all these elites together and try to hold them as one thing and give them a stake in an enterprise called Uganda may require a sharing of resources that you call corruption, which is actually a form of state building. Two, I used to be one of the biggest critics of Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire. But there is one thing over time I have learned about Mobutu, and if I ever find time, I'll write a book about Mobutu. Mobutu was one of the most effective instruments of nation building. At the time he took over Congo in 1965, what we call DRC today had splintered into about 6 or 7 different governments. The different parts of Congo did not recognize the existence of Kinshasa as a central authority. But how did he build a common Congolese national consciousness? He organized what we would call corruption or loot in Kinshasa and gave the different powerful ethnic elites of the different communities of Congo or Zaire a stake in that entity, in that enterprise, in that experiment called DRC or Zaire. Today, Congolese can quarrel bitterly, even hate each other intensely, but they all recognize that they are Congolese. Even though the Congolese state is absent on most of its territory, you do not have secessionist movements in the DRC. Why? Because he was able to mold the nation. And what was the instrument he used? What we call corruption. I actually think that a lot of what we call corruption today is a criminalization of legitimate politics that are so fundamental to nation building and state consolidation in Africa. Finally, somebody asked if some groups don't benefit more than others through corruption. Of course, every system of governance you put in place, even capitalism, there is Jeff Bezos, who is worth $200 billion in the US. And in the state of Seattle, there are about 15,000 homeless people in the city of Seattle, where Amazon is. California has the richest companies, Google, Apple, Facebook, Accenture, but also has a population of 55,000 homeless people. I don't think you can have any system that can distribute benefits equally. Even in communism, North Korea, China, Russia, they never succeeded in achieving equality. I agree the system has imperfections, but it is a legitimate system that actually allows these states to function. I want somebody to explain to me how politics can work in these poor countries if we removed what we call corruption.
Thank you very much for the panelists. Just 1 minute for each in terms of conclusions. Should we accept corruption as a normal part of African cultures and live with it? Or is there any hope that it can be reduced? Thank you. 1 minute for each, starting from Mr. Mwenda.
Well, I do not know. I believe that what we call corruption, we need to redefine it. If corruption is use of public resources for private gain, I started by arguing that a lot of what we call corruption is actually not even driven by private gain. It is a form of governance that allows different ethnic elites in ethnically diverse poor societies to come together around a common agenda, and the resources they take oftentimes are not used for individual gain. They are used to help in the process of national building and state consolidation. So to even call it corruption, let me call it patronage and clientelism. To call it corruption is to criminalize legitimate means of managing power relations in an ethnically diverse poor society. So we should not even call it corruption. I think it's a legitimate form of governance. And without it, I don't think many of our states and nations can hold together.
Professor Makara.
Well, I want to start from where my friend Mwenda has stopped. I disagree totally with his views about corruption, because if you want to build a society for the future, you must eliminate corruption, because corruption takes away jobs from young people. Corruption discriminates against the weak people of society. It discriminates against women, discriminates against people with disabilities, and creates an unequal society, or really criminalizes the state itself, so to say. And therefore, in Uganda's case and many African countries, all efforts should be geared towards eliminating corruption of any kind, including electoral corruption, including collusion, including influence peddling, and diversion of public resources for private gain. What I see in Uganda is that, whereas Mr. Mwenda says it is good for the society of Uganda would be much better if corruption had not been intensified by the powers that be. I would be seeing better infrastructure, would be seeing better schools, better roads, better education for our children. In Uganda, we are talking about children are studying under the trees. Health facilities have no medicine. And I find it really unfair for someone to say, no, corruption is fine. No, I don't take that view. So I think there is a need to bring sanity into our society by punishing those, seriously punishing those who are engaged in corruption of any kind, so that we can see a future for our children and grandchildren. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Makara. Professor Dorasam, you're on mute.
Thank you. Okay, as much as both the panelists have indicated that there are different definitions of corruption and it needs to be contextualized, I don't think that no matter what the politicians would be looking at in terms of using or proffering public resources and distributing it amongst the poor to justify the sharing of resources, if the effects are glaring in terms of unequal distribution of resources, in terms of looting of public resources, in terms of self-aggrandizement of individuals, politicians, in terms of unequal facilities like education, healthcare facilities, then the ill effects of corruption is becoming more and more pervasive. So those individuals, and as much as we may argue that it is not possible in a governance system to have equity or the equal sharing of resources, but if one has to take away the actions that we defined as corruption in a very, very broad sense, will there be improvement in the quality of life of citizens of a country and the standard of living in terms of socioeconomic development and so forth? So if the answer is yes, then I cannot see any kind of justification for corruption specifically contextualized in the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dorasami. Thank you, Professor Sabiti Makara. Thank you, Mr. Mwenda, for all your contribution to this discussion. We appreciate your availability, your insight, and your time. I know it's very late in places where you are. We will continue to this discussion on corruption and many other forms of political institutions and develop in Africa through this platform or some other platforms. We will stay in touch, and if we receive questions from the audience, we'll be happy to address to channel those questions to you. I know we're in touch. We'll continue the discussion. Thank you very much. Have a good night where you are. I now turn the word to Professor Sami, the director of the Normal Pattern School of International Affairs, Carleton University, to say a concluding word. Thank you very much. And thanks for the audience. Thank all for participating.
You didn't have to ask me because my video is on, but since you have, I just wanted to thank everyone. Like you said, I know it's a bit late in other parts of the world. So thank you to the panelists for an interesting conversation. And like Deki said, we hope to continue this dialogue in the future. Bruce, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks, Deki, for organizing this event. And thank you for the panelists. I think it's been a very interesting series of comments. And there are some questions and answers, even though we're running out of time. We will that address some of the questions that the different panelists made. So I'm hoping that the Africa Study Group and NIPSIA, and indeed more generally people who are involved in this, can have further discussions on these things and maybe make some progress. So thank you very much. And this will be the video will be. If it may be too long, we have to divide it in two, but we hope to have the video on the Africa Study Group's YouTube channel fairly soon. Thank you very much, and have a good night or evening, depending on the time of day you're talking at.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Deki.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye to all of you.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Thanks,
Hey.
Deki. Talk to you again. I have several things I want to talk to you about.